Welcome back to the Puddin' Creek Rod Shop. Now, we don't have time to be standing around gawking at the Studebaker girl. We've got to get back to work on the Ojai coupe. Now, if you've been watching the channel very long, you know we're building a 1932 Ford coupe, and we're building it the traditional way. In other words, the way they would have built it in the 1940s or 1950s. We're taking the original 32 Ford rear end out of the car, and instead we're putting in a 1940 Ford rear end. To do that, we had to modify the rear frame crossmember to accept the straight 1940 Ford rear end spring. Here's the original center section that we modified for the 40 Ford spring. Now, as you can see, after modification, the center square hole is no longer where it's supposed to be. It's shifted about 3/16 of an inch. So that's going to be our first job for today. We've got to correct the hole location and get this thing perfectly centered in the rear crossmember section. Now, if you're an old machinist, I don't have to tell you what's in this little red case. You're already talking to your TV or telling your wife. That's a stare at last word indicator set he's got there. From reading the comments, though, I know some of you guys are just getting into the machining hobby or job, and you watch my videos to get a tip here or there. Well, here we go. If you want a dial indicator that's tough as nails but still accurate, get a stare at last word indicator. But if you're just going for all-out precision, I would buy a Brown & Sharp Best Test indicator, the Swiss-made ones. The Brown & Sharp Best Test indicator is deadly accurate, but it's a little finicky. You can't be too rough with it. The stare at last word indicator, it's just about as accurate, and it's just tough as nails. You could drop a Muncie transmission on it and it'll still work. Not really, but almost. Now, the rest of you guys, the hot rodders, you're probably saying, Puddin' Creek, I thought we were doing frame fabrication. What's the indicator for? Well, I clamped this aluminum block up on the milling machine table to use as a fixture so we can mill that square hole out where it needs to be. And to line it up, you can see here, slid a parallel down in one of the T-slots and pulled the aluminum block back against it. Now I'm just running an indicator across it just to see how close that got me, just to see how close the T-slots are on this machine. Looks like they're pretty doggone close. Now, the next thing I need to do is find the existing location of that square hole, set a 0, shift it 3/16 of an inch, and recut it in its new location. To find its current location, I'm going to use this 1/2-inch square piece of key stock in a round collet. I know, square peg and a round hole. You're thinking, Puddin' Creek, have you been drinking the blinker fluid again? I think as long as I don't let one of the square corners of the key stock end up in the slot of the collet, that it will work. Let's try it and see. Well, looky there. You guys just got to have more faith in your old buddy Puddin' Creek. Now we zero out the digital readout, and then we can shift the hole location 3/16 of an inch. Not only do I have to shift the location of this square hole, I also have to make it bigger. Here's a good piece of information for you in case you're going to put a 40 Ford rear end in your 32. The 32 Ford rear end spring bolt square head is 1/2-inch square. The 40 Ford rear end spring bolt square head bolt is 9/16 square. I'm using a 1/8 inch diameter end mill to recut this square hole, and the reason I'm using such a small end mill is to keep the corner radius small. That way there's not much corner radius for me to file out by hand. Now, when you're using these small diameter end mills, an air blast is way more important than lubricant, I did spray a shot of WD-40 on this end mill before I started cutting, but mainly I'm using the air blast to keep all the chips cleared. You don't want the chips to pile up in between the flutes of those tiny end mills because that'll cause them to break off. Well, that didn't take long at all. Now the new hole is 9/16 by 9/16 and it's located directly in the center of the cross member. The only thing we got left to do is fill up the part of the old hole from where we shifted the location. So we're going to need a little tab to weld in to fill up that part of the old hole that's remaining. Now I could have grabbed an angle grinder and a cutoff wheel and cut out a piece and deburred it and sanded it to size. But instead of going through all that, I already had this 1/8" end mill in the milling machine. So I just threw a piece of 3/16 stock in there and machined a little tab out. It comes out perfectly square and ready to weld in the hole. It literally took me less than 5 minutes to make it. I stopped short of cutting it completely off with the machine. I left it attached so I can break it off with my fingers, and that way the end mill doesn't sling it halfway across the room and I have to get on my hands and knees and search for it. So I deburred the little filler piece that I made. Now I'm going to use a magnet to hold it in place so it'll be just exactly where it needs to be for me to TIG weld it in. Next, just one last check with the calipers to make sure everything came out like it was supposed to come out. You know the old saying, measure twice and weld once, or something like that. Now I'm really hoping this is the last time I'll have to walk it out here in the parking lot and check the fitment on this spring. I hope it comes out perfect. I don't want to have to lick my calf twice. Good googly moogly, it's perfect. Now we've got an original Henry Ford, 32 Ford, center cross member section that fits a 1940 Ford rear spring perfectly. Now before we proceed with the next step on the cross member, let me uncover the Ojai coupe here and let me give you guys an idea why we're going to all this work. Now this is the actual tire wheel combo we'll be running on the back of the Ojai coupe. It'll have 40 Ford wheels and these 750/16 Firestone Coker bi-ply tires. Well, the car is sitting so low on this pallet that this tire is not going to show what I wanted to show you guys. Let's go another direction. These are 14-inch tires. These are the tires and wheels that came on the Lady Luck coupe when I first found it. These were on it from the 1970s. These were Keystone Rogue wheels. I think these were popular right before Keystone Classics came out. Now obviously this is not the right diameter tire. These are 14 inches, so it doesn't match the fender well radius very well. But at the top of the tire, I want about this much gap between the top of the tire and the fender reveal there. About an inch or maybe an inch and a half is all I want. That's why we're flattening this cross member, to get this baby down low and down next to the tire. Just for a reminder, this is how high it's set before. This is factory height from Henry Ford. All right, break's over. Let's get it. Now you guys remember from the last video on this, before I cut this cross member apart, I made a 1/2 inch square locator pin that went right up through that square hole and welded to the cross support on the bottom so that I wouldn't lose that location, so that after I cut this apart, I could weld that center section back in and it would be exactly where it was before. Now my new hole is 9/16 of an inch square instead of 1/2 inch, so I've got to change the tip of the locator pin. But not only that, most guys think that the wheels set a little too far forward from the factory, the way Henry made them, and they look better if you shift them back a 1/2 inch or so in the wheel wells. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weld this new 9/16 locator pin on the back side of the 1/2 inch pin that's already there. That'll shift me backwards a little bit and help the look of the wheel being centered in the wheel wells maybe. Now I'm up to probably the hardest part of this whole project, trying to trim these side pieces to get that center section to fit back in and weld back in perfectly. I'm going to make a sheet metal pattern or template to help me lay out those cut lines accurately. Now what I'm using to do this is the Beverly shear that I bought out of the famous race car builder Tom Hanna's estate. It's hard telling how many famous race car body skins have passed through the jaws of this shear. Well, I know what you're thinking. Puddin' Creek, that Milwaukee saw you're using looks like it's brand new. It don't even have any grease on it or scratches or anything. And I know what else you're thinking. Like the old saying goes, never hire a carpenter that's carrying a brand new tape measure and a brand new hammer and a brand new tool belt. Well, you would be right. I asked the little woman to stop at Northern Tool and pick me up one of these so I could give it a try on this project. And man alive, does it cut good. This is a fabricator's samurai sword right here. Without the battery, it was $120 at Northern Tool. I recommend it. It's cutting absolutely fantastic. And before you light up my comments, no, I'm not sponsored by Milwaukee. I sure would like to be, but I'm not sponsored by anybody. The little woman sponsors me with a pan of biscuits once in a while. When she picked up the saw, I also had her pick me up a pack of these Diablo carbide tip blades. I thought they would be pretty easy to chip and wouldn't last very long, but they last great. Haven't had any problems with the carbide tips chipping whatsoever. All right, we've got the sides trimmed out. We've got the centerpiece mocked up. I ended up cutting the square locator pin out. I marked it before I did so I can take it in and out and double check my location at any time. Right now I'm just pulling a tape to double check the double check. Before I start doing any welding, I want to make sure this thing's centered up perfectly, or as close as I can get it, to the center of the frame. Now, in case you ever wondered, on a 32 Ford frame, right here's where one of your numbers are stamped, right there above the rear crossmember. That's how all this got started, if you remember. Tennessee wanted me to send them a pencil tracing of the serial number to get me a title on this car. I took the body off to get a pencil tracing, saw how bad the K-member was, replaced it, decided to pancake the rear crossmember while I was at it. One thing leads to another. You guys know it's called hot rodding. I had this old rack gear that's perfectly flat and perfectly straight on the back side, so I used some big C clamps and the rack gear to clamp all three pieces up and make sure they're perfectly straight. When I pulled the rack gear off and checked everything with a long straight edge, a long scale, it was really close but not perfect. You know, we're taking a centerpiece that's been highly modified, and then we're attaching it to two side pieces that were heated and bent, using the rack gear to pull it all in line, trying to get it in one complete plane, all three pieces, and that's kind of hard to do. There's some stresses there and some flexing. So what I did is I reclamped the rack gear back to it to pull it all together flat, and then I'm going to heat these side bends one last time just to kind of relax them, to let everything relax, take the stress out of the cross member, and have it all be on one solid flat plane. All right, our next problem is these corners right here don't line up, so that's going to require some slicing and dicing. I made a series of relief cuts here, and now I can heat up the part that I left attached, and I can bend those side pieces back toward me to line those two corner radiuses up with the center section. I got the two front edges to match pretty good, so I went ahead and gave that a tack weld to hold it in place. Now that whole radius that I cut loose doesn't quite fit in where it needs to go. I'm going to need to heat this up right below the radius and hammer it in, and then probably heat it a second time and hammer it down flat. It's going to take two operations to get this to fit just like I want it to fit and flow together all as one piece. You know, pancaking a cross member is a pretty in-depth thing. If anybody tells you, oh, there's nothing to it, you see by what I'm doing here, it's a pretty involved job. It's kind of 3D sculpting. Some of you guys have commented that I'm getting this stuff way too hot. I know in the video it looks like this is white hot, like it's so hot it's about to melt and drip out in the floor, but that's just the camera doing that. In real life, I'm just heating this stuff up cherry red. It's not white hot like it looks in the camera. These early Ford cross members are made out of 3/16 thick steel, so you do have to get them cherry red to bend them. It's not sheet metal we're dealing with here. By this point, I've got the radius fitting good. It's all flowing together real nice. I just need to hammer this top edge down flat with the cross member, and once I get that done, I can do the other side and then set up and do some welding. Some of you guys are saying, boy, that's the biggest body hammer I think I've ever seen. Well, me too. The little woman and I one year were walking around the turkey run in Daytona, the swap meet, and I came upon a booth where a lady was selling some tools, and she had this big old giant body hammer for sale. And I said, how much? She said, $20. And I said, I'll take it. And then I had to carry it around all day. All right, I got both sides heated and bent in. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's throw a level on it, give it one last check, make sure that heat hadn't distorted anything, and then I'm going to call it a day. Go home and see what the little woman's got for supper. Well, it looks like we're having breakfast for supper. Do you guys ever have breakfast for supper, or is that just a southern thing? And man, take a look at the size of these eggs. The little woman's chickens are laying nuclear-sized eggs. I mean atomic eggs, since we gassed their legs a while back. Now, friends and neighbors, Puddin' Creek Rod Shop subscribers, and the whole hee-haw gang, I want to let you know that this is a first for me. What you think you're seeing is actually what you're seeing. We are dipping these chickens' legs in gasoline. Ever since we gassed the chickens' legs, they've been laying these giant, oversized eggs that they did not lay before. It's the strangest phenomenon ever. I mean, these eggs are so big you can't even close the lid on the egg carton. Now, the only gas I had around to use was high-octane, non-ethanol hot rod gas. That's the only thing I can figure. So if you're going to gas your chicken's legs, be sure and use high octane. So I come into the shop the next day and it's a complete mess. The torch hoses are wound up in the drop cords, which are wound up in the welding cables. Man, you can tell I was in the heat of battle yesterday. Now I want to bevel all this out real good and get ready to weld it. To weld it, we're going to use the copper backing plate method. I'm not going to make a wide piece and put in those big gaps. I'm just going to put a copper backing plate behind it and burn it in with a heavy weld so it'll be nice and strong. That's just the way I do it. A lot of guys like to use a TIG welder on these, but I like to use the wire welder when I'm sculpting because I can bend and form and shape and zap it and clamp it and zap it and heat it and zap it. It's just fast and easy. The fastest way I've found to bevel out all these cuts in preparation for welding is to use this electric die grinder with an angled carbide burr in it. I mean, that does it pretty doggone quick. And this electric die grinder I got from Snap-on. No, wait, it wasn't Snap-on. It was that other place that sells high-quality tools. It was Harbor Freight. Here we are, friends and neighbors, like Arlo Guthrie said in that song. Shovels and rakes and implements of destruction. Well, there they all are. That's what we use to bevel out all those grooves and take the wire brush and get all the scale off of it and get ready to start slinging some weld. We're going to put our copper backing plates behind this and start welding up these big grooves right now immediately. And for all you young hot rodders who are saying, who in the world is Arlo Guthrie? Well, you can Google it. Now you can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. Now, even though this is all tacked up and shouldn't move around on me, I'm not going to get too crazy with the heat, so I'm only going to weld halfway through this joint and then stop and probably move around and weld the other side. So I got the front side of the cross member all welded up and ground down. Now let's move around to the back side. You can see what I'm working with here. I've got a 1/2 inch offset that I have to correct for. So what I did is I laid me out some cut lines. I made them a 1/2 inch wide up at the gap side, and then I narrowed them all the way back to where they met at 0. So from 0 to a 1/2 inch, I'm going to take this wedge shape out. Then we can heat it and bend it in and match those radiuses up just like we did on the front side of the cross member. Now notice when I picked my wedge-shaped place to cut out that I moved over past the radius. I don't want to cut any of the radius off and have to build that back up. I just want to cut out flat metal, bend that radius in where it matches the radius to the centerpiece, and then weld up flat metal. That way I don't really have to deal with the radius much. Now I'm cutting the relief cut in the back of the radius. You need a relief here so it'll bend in, and I will need a relief at the flange right directly below that too. Hey, now that's fitting pretty doggone good. Why, when we get done, this cross member is going to look like old Henry Ford made it himself, with Edsel Ford holding the tape measure. Now this piece actually fit in there really good. I just see that one high spot there right at the front end. It's going to have to be heated and bent in, but for the most part, this fit great. Well, I got both sides heated and bent in, and it turned out pretty good. Now, there is an area right here at the front that I'm going to run a cutoff wheel through and open that up to give me some room for my weld to penetrate and go down in, a weld gap. It's the same on both sides, but that's what I had to do to get that radius to match up. But it's no big deal. Just run a cutoff wheel through there and open it up to look like the rest of the joint, and then we can start slinging some weld. And for all you guys that say I couldn't believe he cut up a mint Henry Ford crossmember, well, somebody'd already got a hold of this one with a cutting torch back in the 50s or 60s or 70s, or could be the 80s, who knows. So it wasn't mint. It was a nice crossmember, but it was not mint. I saved all the pieces that I cut out of this deal when I was chopping it up, and I picked out the two best ones and went ahead and cleaned them up and deburred them and chamfered the edges. I've got one marked for driver's side and one for passenger side, but we'll use those to fill in those wedge-shaped holes that we need to fill in. As you can see right here, I've already got my copper backing plate clamped in place. Now I just need to do a little final touch-up grinding and fit this little wedge-shaped patch in. The copper plate will line it up flush on the back side, and I'm going to use a magnet to line it up flush on the bottom side with the flange. The front side doesn't have a flange, so we can just make a little pattern and cut these out of 3/16 thick flat stock. With all those final wedges welded in, now we've got a solid cross member again. Now we don't need this cross brace that's holding the frame width the perfect distance apart. You know, as I'm back to work today, I'm still thinking about those giant eggs the little woman's getting from her chickens. I may need to ask my neighbor about that. He's kind of an expert on chickens. A while back, I went over to his house to visit, and as I was pulling in the driveway, this dang chicken comes flying out in front of my car, running faster than any chicken I've ever seen run ever. And it almost looked like it had 3 legs instead of 2. So when I got up to my neighbor's house, he was standing out in the front yard, and I asked him, I said, did I see what I think I saw? Did that chicken have 3 legs? And he said, it sure did. He said, I raised them like that. I said, you raised 3-legged chickens? He said, yeah. He said, my wife likes chicken legs. The kids, they all like chicken legs. I like chicken legs. So he said, I've been crossbreeding and experimenting, and I came up with a 3-legged chicken. And I said, well, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. I said, I didn't even know that was scientifically possible. I said, what do they taste like? He said, I don't know, we ain't caught one yet. After I got those wedge-shaped pieces welded in, I just hit them real quick with this flap disc, and here's what I've got. They came out really good. There's just a few low places, and there's not going to be any filler in this cross member. That's not the kind of build we're doing. We're kind of doing a rough, gritty, sweaty, old-school 1940s, 50s type build. So what I'm going to do is just fill these low places in with weld and grind them smooth. Man, oh man, we've almost got this rear cross member completely finished. I've got one last thing I need to do. Right there where I bent those sides up and put the wedges in, all that doesn't match perfectly on the bottom, so I'm going to hit it with a little blue Dykem layout fluid, and we're going to blend those together. Now I'm just going to line up my trusty Brown & Sharp 6-inch scale with a long, straight, angled section there on the bottom, and we'll scribe a line, and that way we can grind this little wart off the bottom and continue that long straight edge out. And the other side's got the exact same wart, so it's going to get the exact same fix. Man alive. Now, I mean, that was a lot of work, but boy, did it sure come out nice. Old Henry Ford put so many nice curves and radiuses and angles and flanges in this rear cross member that even when you hack it up and chop it up and weld it all back together Frankenstein style, it still comes out really slick and curvy and quite elegant looking. Now, I had to go home at night and dig a lot of grinding dust out of my ears and in between my teeth, but it was all worth it. This really makes a super cool looking, flattened, pancaked 32 Ford rear cross member. Now, you guys thinking what I'm thinking? Shoot, yeah, let's get that 1940 Ford rear end in here and see how it fits. Now, before I start tearing that 40 Ford rear end apart, we've got one more little piece of business we need to take care of. You guys commented and messaged me and rightly pointed out that when I gave you all those rear end dimensions in the previous video, I didn't give you the dimension from the center of the axle back to the center of the spring pack. Well, it wasn't like I didn't measure it before I started cutting up a 1932 Ford frame. I did measure it, I just didn't video it. So we're going to do that right now. Now, I know there's at least two of you good old boys out there that are watching this video, maybe on the shop TV while you're working on cars, or maybe in one of your all's basement while you're drinking a beer and sitting on the couch. And one of you just elbowed the other one and said, look at that, look at there. He's pulled string across that. You see that? I recognize that string. That's masonry string. I've been telling you old Puddin' Creek ain't no real hot rodder. I bet he's a block layer or a brick mason. If he pulls out a line level, that's it. It's over. We're going to turn the channel. We're going to go back to watching Bad Chad. From the center bolt of the spring pack to the center line of the axle, the 32 Ford measured 7 inches. On the 40 Ford, the measurement was 7 1/8 inches. And of course, we're dealing with a spring which moves around, and the rubber in the spring hanger bushings is probably, degraded some. So I would guess when these left the factory, both of them were meant to be 7 inches. The torque tube and the drive shaft on the 40 Ford rear end is way too long, so that'll get cut in another video. But right now, I just want to get it unbolted and get it out of the way so we can roll the rear end inside and try it out in the new cross member we just pancaked. The first step to remove an early Ford torque tube is to remove the speedometer drive. If you look in this window in the side of the torque tube, you can see the speedometer drive gear there, and right in front of the speedometer drive gear is a ring clip that we have to remove. That's the next step. I just used a long skinny screwdriver to reach back in one of the flutes of the drive shaft and pop the clip ring up out of its groove, and then used a pair of needle nose pliers to pull it off the shaft. It's no big deal whatsoever. Next step was to unbolt the front of the rear radius rods from the torque tube. There's just one bolt. Now I use a tapered punch to drive the bolt out of its hole. Anytime you do this, you always want to use a smaller diameter tapered punch than what the diameter of the bolt is, because you don't want to beat up the end of the threads. Now, I know all you old hot rodders are saying, we all know that, Puddin' Creek, we're not stupid. Well, this tip's not for you. When I put these simple little tips in my videos, these are for like the 15 or 16-year-old kid that just inherited an A model from his grandpa, and he's just trying to learn the basics to get started, and somehow or another he found my YouTube channel and he said, old Puddin' Creek, he looks pretty basic. That's a good place to start. Once you get all that unbolted, your torque tube should slide right off your drive shaft. Shouldn't be any problem because it's nice and greasy in there. On the 40 Ford rear end, there's a coupling right here at the back of the drive shaft, and there's two pins in that coupling that pins the drive shaft to the rear end splines. So what we're going to do is grind the head off one of those pins and knock it out. Now the hole in the coupling is countersunk or V'd, so some of the head of that pin is mashed down in that countersink. So what we're going to do here is use a split point drill to drill some of that out and get rid of it, and we should be able to knock this pin right out. These pins are just a slip fit. They're not a press fit or anything crazy, so once you get the head drilled out and ground off, you can just take a punch and peck them right out. It's no big deal. Now to pull this drive shaft off, you're going to want some rubber gloves. I mean, unless you're old school hot rodder, one of those guys that's still using 80W90 to grease your ducktail back. To roll that rear end inside, I'm going to have to get Lady Luck out of the way. It's been all covered up here in one of these Amazon bags to keep it from getting grinding dust on it. I carefully roll the bag with the dirty side in to keep the grinding dust off the paint job, and I'll just throw the bag away when I get it off. Man, every time I get in this thing, I feel like the 1970s. It was built in the 1970s. It still smells like the 1970s inside. The first thing I want to do after I crank it up is turn up some Foreigner on the radio. Hot-blooded. I left this temporary brace that I made in for right now to give me a place to jack the frame up so I can roll the rear end under. At this point, I'm trying to line that square head bolt up in that square hole, and that's really all I've got on my brain. You're noticing from your angle, from the camera's angle, that frame's sitting crooked. And the more you let it down, the more crooked it gets. Well, I'm not noticing that yet. I'm still trying to get that square head in that square hole. Now, it's about this time that I come out of my daze and realize that this frame is sitting lopsided, and I'm thinking to myself, I know I didn't weld that cross member up crooked. What is going on? And it's about that time that I notice, oh, it's hitting these big blocks that I had the frame sitting on. As I'd let it down, the wishbones, rear radius rods there, they'd bottomed out on these blocks. So now I'm going to have to jack it back up a little bit and get these wood blocks out of the way. But just for a split second, I was trying to run through my brain if my level was off or my eye was off or how I welded that thing up crooked. You ever do that? You ever have that split second thought, man, I really messed this thing up? Well, come to find out, it came out just about perfect once you get the wood blocks out of the way. Well, that's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. I hope some of this information will help you a little bit if you decide to flatten your rear cross member. If you go over to our channel, I made a playlist of all the videos so far of this car, the Ojai Coupe. So there's videos on there all the way back from where we found the car and bought the car, the whole 9 yards, everything we've ever done to the car. There's a playlist of all the videos. So if you're one of those guys that likes to watch a whole build from start to finish, go check that playlist out and start from the beginning. We sure appreciate you guys watching our videos every week. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe if you hadn't already.